Today's daf in Masechet Zevachim is daf Kuf Dal at 104. If I'm correct, we had trouble now, but I figure remembering which daf it was. Yeah, tell me if something goes off with the sound. There's a little small space here. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay, says the Mishnah. We're gonna start on daf Kuf Gimel Amud, right? The Mishnah. That's right. I figured everyone's up to. So one of the halachot as we get towards the end of Zevachim, one of the halachot we've talked about is that for many animals, the skin of the animal went to the Kohen. So whether it was an ola, where you actually burned all of the meat and you burned all of the organs, right? Or it was a chatas, where you burned some of the organs, but you ate the meat, the Kohanim ate the meat, or shlamim, where the Yisrael got the meat. In the first two cases, at least, not in the shlamim, the skin goes to the Kohanim. So says our Mishnah, something very interesting, that the skin going to the Kohen depends on the carbon being done properly. So says the Mishnah, Kol HaKadashim, She'ira Behem Pesul. If you have a psul in the karban, let's say it becomes tamei, or you do the wrong thoughts or something, if it's koden lehafshitan, if the psul happens before you skin the animal, so before you lay the animal, separate the skin from the animal, then ein oroteim lekohanim. Then the skin does not go to the kohen. And basically, if you have to get rid of the karban, you get rid of the skin too. You burn it, you destroy it, and you throw it away. But la'achar hafshitan, if the psul happens after you've skinned the animal, then oratem the kohanim. Okay, then the skin goes to the kohen. We're going to see in the Gemara this is a little bit more complex than the Mishnah makes it, as usual, and that it really has to do with the fact of whether you do zrika or not, right? So let's say you shecht an animal, right? You get blood in a cup. Usually, then you would take the blood and sprinkle it on the mizbeach. But let's say there was a line, or you waited for some reason, and you cut up the animal and skinned it before you sprinkled it on the mizbeach. Right, so there's going to be an opinion. We're going to see Rebbe's opinion that's really what matters. If you do zrika on the mizbeach, then the skin becomes mutar, even if then the basar, the meat, becomes pasul, right? But as long as they're separate, you just keep the skin and you burn the meat. But if they're together, you burn them both and you don't use them. Says the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, says Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, who of course was alive in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, he was a Skan HaKohanim. Miyamai, in all my days, lower iti or shiyotzei lebeit hasrifa, I never saw them take skin and put it in and burn it. Meaning, I never saw this happen, so I don't think it's true. Meaning, I never saw a skin that was already separated from an animal that they said, oh, wait a second, the animal is pasul, let's get rid of the skin. So according to Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, this doesn't happen. We'll see why in the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Akiva, says Rabbi Akiva, midvarav lamadnu, from Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim's words, we learn, mafshit et habechor. Let's say you do hafshet, you skin a bechor. Remember, a bechor can be brought as a karban if it's healthy. If a bechor gets a mum, then it's no longer brought as a karban, you just eat it, right? But if you skin a bechor, v'nimsat treifa, you find that it's a treifa. Now, you couldn't have found that without skinning it, because I guess you couldn't get the whole animal open and cut apart. I guess you could have, but you didn't, right? So basically, you found out that it had a pre-existing wound after you skinned it. So then, the Kohanim get to keep that skin. Because since at the time that basically, we'll see this in Gemara, but since at the time that you basically shechted the animal and you thought, or you sprinkled the blood if it was in the Beit HaMikdash, it was kosher, you only found out later that after you skinned it, that there was a problem with the animal, you get to keep the skin. Because that's what Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim implies, that you never have a case where you take off the skin and then you have to then throw it away. And say the rabbis, Chachamim Omrim, Ein lo re'inu raya. That's not a proof of anything. The fact that Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim never saw it happen doesn't mean it never happened. And it did happen. And in fact, you have to throw away that skin. And the halacha is, say the Rabbanan, Yatsa lebeit hasrifa, that if you shech the animal, and you skin it, and you find out that it was a treifa the whole time, so at the time you skinned it, it was already a treifa, and therefore it was dead, right? But it was a treifa from life, it was already pasul, and therefore you have to get rid of that skin, you cannot use it. So that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, what does it mean, right? So now we quote a Braita, which says the following: Kol shel lo zacha mizbeach b'bsara, wherever the mizbeach doesn't get its pound of flesh, its meat, meaning you can't burn the basar on the mizbeach because the animal became pasul, because you had a bad machshava, or because it became tamei, then lo zachu hakohanim be'ora. Then the kohanim don't get the meat, don't get the skin. Meaning those things are conditional. If the mizbeach gets its part, the kohanim get their part. If not, not. Says the Braita, v'af agav da'af shetei la'ar kodim zrika. This implies even if you took off you skinned the animal before zrika, meaning you basically shechted the animal, you skinned it, You then did zrikat hadam. So when you did zrikat hadam, the skin was separate from the basar, and it was all kosher. After zrikat hadam, something happened to the basar. Let's say it became overnight, or it became tamei, or you had a machshava during zrika that made it pigel, right? So now you can't eat the meat. But in the implication of this bright is you also can't you can't use the skin. Says where who is that? Who's the author of that? Money. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimoni. That's Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon. The Amar ein hadam ratzeh al haor b'fnei atzma. If again, the situation here is that the skin is separate from the meat. You took the blood and you sprinkled on the mizbeach. The meat turned out to be puzzle because it was tummy, but the skin was okay. So it says Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon that's not good. You can't use that skin in that circumstance because since the meat was ended up not being kosher, the skin is not kosher or not usable for the kohanim either. That's Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Ema Seifus. So then look at the next part of the Breita. The next part of the Breita says the following: Kol kachim shira behem psul kodem hef shaitan. Any carbon where you have a psul in the carbon before you skin it, meaning while the meat is still attached to the skin, then ein oroteim the kohanim. Then the skin does not go to the kohen, but la'achar hef shaitan oroteim the kohanim. If it's after the hefshet, then the skin does go to the kohen. So this implies the opposite on the Rebbe. This is the opinion of Rebbe. We'll see in a second these two opinions that basically argue about this exact scenario where you shech the animal, you then skin it, right? The skin and the meat are separate; they're in different parts of the Beit Hamikdash, and then you do zrika. And so when you do zrika, and then you find out that the meat was puzzle. So does zrika allow you to use the skin, even though it doesn't allow you to do the meat? So the Reisha of the Breita implied that it does. That does not. Sorry, that you're not allowed to use the skin in that case. That's Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon, right? And the Sefer of the Breita implies that you can. That as long as you separated the skin from the meat before the zrika, and you then did zrika, you're allowed to use the skin. So on the Rebbe. So that seems to be the opinion of Rebbe. The Amar, we're 4 lines from the bottom of Kuf Gimel Amabet. On the Rebbe, that goes back to Rebbe. The Amar Hadam Ratzala or Bifnei Atzmo. That the blood of the Mizbech can be miratzeh for the skin by itself. So that's problematic because Reisha Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, Sefer Rebbe, question mark? Right? How could the two parts of a Breita have two conflicting opinions? Usually we say the names if that's the case. But here the Breita seems to imply both halachot. So how do you explain the Breita? Answers Abaya, Amar Abaya, you're right. It can't be that case. Mida Seifa Rebbe, he, Reisha Nami Rebbe. Since the Seifa is Rebbe, the Reisha is also Rebbe. And again, I just want to go through the case one more time. The machloket here is, you shechted an animal as a carbon. At the time you shechted it, you thought everything was okay. You then skinned the animal. So you took the skin off the meat, which is unusual because usually you would just sprinkle the blood right away. But you skinned the animal before you sprinkled the blood. Then you sprinkled the blood on the Mizbeach. And then you found out, oh, wait, there's something wrong with the meat. The meat is puzzle, it's tamei, its machshava was bad, whatever the reason is, right? So Rebbe says it doesn't matter. Since the skin was separate from the meat at the time of the zrika is mechaper, or allows, not mechaper, but allows you to use the skin. And it doesn't matter as long as you separated the skin from the meat, right? And Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon says that's not true. As long as you can't use the meat, you can't use the skin. So it says Abaya now, 2 lines from the bottom. The whole Breita is Rebbe. Umod the Rebbe she'ein havshei kodem zrika. The Rebbe admits that this case never happens or is uncommon to happen, right? Because it's unlikely that you're ever going to skin the animal before zrika. Because you don't have time, right? You don't want the blood to coagulate. It takes a long time to skin an animal. So they would almost always do the zrika first. But in theory, if you didn't, for some weird circumstance, it would be okay. But usually you wouldn't do it. And that was what the Breita meant. Rava says, I disagree, and I say the opposite. I say, Mida Reisha Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, since the Reisha implies like Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, that there's a complete connection between the meat and the skin, the Seifa is also Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, right? Seifa Nami Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. Umay Kodem Hefshet. Now, when the Seifa of the Breita said, if you did it before, if it became pasul before you skinned it, it's okay. But it's not okay. But if after you skinned it, it is okay, what that means is, my kodem hefshet and my achar hefshet, top line of daf kuf dal amud aleph, it means kodem shenir'u lehefshet. It means if it happened before it was ra'oy lehefshet, meaning after zrika. Achar shenir'u lehefshet, right? So that is how you have to understand the Breita. It doesn't literally mean skinning it. It means skinning it after zrika because you assume you have to do zrika. So that is the first segment of the Gemara. Now, it says the Gemara in segment number 2, which is the second line of Kuf Dal Amud Aleph, which you'd think we would have started with. My Rebbe, my Rebbe Lazar Rabbi Shimon. What is this machloket that you've been referencing the whole time that you never told us about? Right? What's the machloket Rebbe and Rebbe Lazar Rabbi Shimon? Tanya. Now we have the Breita, which basically elaborates the whole thing. And as the Masorah Shas points out here, this is a Tosefta here in Zevachim. So this is a Breita that was authored by Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon, and Rebbe. What does the Breita say? It's very hot here. The Breita says the following: third line from Daf Kuf Daled Amud Aleph. Rebbe Omer. Rebbe comes out and says, Hadam miratzeh al ha'or b'fnei atzmo. Right? The blood is miratzeh, and miratzeh means it allows the Kohanim to go and use it. If it's by himself, meaning if the skin is by itself, such as an example where you skin the animal before zrika, right? And of course, kishu im basar, and when it's with the meat, which is of course the normal case, that it would be the meat and the skin would be together. Now, nolad bo psul, if something turns out to be pasul in the animal, right? Bein kodem zrika, bein la'achar zrika, harehu ki yotzebo. Whether the psul happens before zrika or after zrika, as long as I read the Breita a little bit wrong. Let me read it again. Sorry. The Tanya from the third line. Rebbe Omer hadam ratzel ha'or b'fnei atzmo. Kama. Okay. When the skin is by itself, meaning you've already separated the skin from the meat, you've already done what you call it, flaying, then the blood is mechaper. Meaning it allows the kohanim to use it. Ukishu im basar. Now, if the skin is still attached to the basar, then the following. Then it depends on the status of the basar. Nolad bo psul, if a psul happens in the meat, bein kodem zrika bein lachas zrika re'u ki yotzebo, then the skin is treated just like the basar. So when they're attached, whatever happens to the meat happens to the skin. When they're detached, the skin could become mutar to the kohanim, even if the meat does not become mutar, as long as you did the zrika. Okay, that's Rebbe's opinion. Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon Omer, the second opinion in the Breita, no, ein adam ratzel ha'or b'fnei atzmo. The blood will never be meratzel in the or by itself, meaning if you separated the or, the skin, from the meat, the blood itself is not enough to say that the kohanim can keep it. Ukashuim basar, when it's attached to the meat, which is typical when the animal was died right away. Nolad bo psul, if there's a psul kodem zrika, hareyu ki yotzebo. If the psul happens before zrika, then you treat the skin like the meat and you throw it away, you burn it, basically, like what we would do for meat. But if the psul happens la'achar zrika, then hurtza, right? Where am I? I lost the place here. Then if hurtza basar sha'achat, if there was one moment that the basar was butter, meaning let's say it became tamei afterwards, but at the time you did the zrika, the basar was okay, then yafshitenna v'orol kohanim. Then you could skin it and you give the skin to the kohanim. So that is the opinion of Rav Elazar Rabbi Shimon, that you can't ever have a situation where if the basar didn't make it to zrika, you're allowed to use the skin. But even if you separated it, according to Rebbe, as long as you separated it, even before the zrika, the basar was puzzle, doesn't matter. The zrika would be okay for the skin. According to Rav Elazar Rabbi Shimon, never. Until you do zrika and it's okay. If after you do zrika, it turns out that the basar becomes tamei, let's say, or pasul, you can skin it and you can use it for the kohanim. Okay? That is all the halachot of the Breita. What's the machloket, says the Gemara? Lema, let us say it's going on a much earlier machloket of Tanaim from 2 generations before of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua Kamifliki. What's the machloket of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? The Bach here adds the word Ditanya, which makes sense, right? Ditanya, I think the Bach, so someone adds the word. Aleph, let's see, Aleph. Oh, I have a Hagoot, sorry. Not the Shita adds the word Ditanya. Ditanya, as we learned in a Breita, it says in the Pasuk, the following, Vasita olotecha basar v'adam. Do your ola, the meat and the blood. So that's a commonality between the meat and the blood together. What does that tell you? Rabbi Yeshua says it tells you the following. Im ein dam, ein basar. If the blood was not done properly on the Mizbeach, the basar does not become permitted. Im ein basar, ein dam, and vice versa. If let's say you shechted an animal, right, and the basar all became puzzle before you had sprinkled the blood on the Mizbeach, stop and don't put the blood on the Mizbeach. Because you can't put blood on the Mizbeach if you have no meat left over. Even though the kapara comes from the blood. So the poor owner is going to have to bring another carbon. But if there's no basar, there's no dam. These things are connected. That is Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's not true. You can have dam afal pi she'ein basar. Even if all the meat was puzzle or thrown away or tameh, you can still sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach. Shenemar, because it says at the end of the pasuk, the dam zivachecha yishafech. The dam of a carbon you pour. The dam is independent. Im kain matam lomer vasita lotecha basar vadam. So why does the first part of the pasuk connect the meat and the blood together? To tell you this, we learned this a couple weeks ago, I think maybe 3 weeks ago in the daf with together, that ma dam bizrika af basar bizrika. This was more than that, actually. This was months ago. But we did learn it together, I remember. That just like the blood has to be thrown on the Mizbeach, because it always says Zarakat Adam, etc., the meat has to be thrown on the Mizbeach. If you recall, we learned earlier that they would go to the top of the ramp and they would throw the meat onto the fire. And there had to be a space in the ground, not in the ground, in between the ramp and the Mizbeach, so you were throwing it over the ground, right? Halamadata sherevach yesh ben kevesh l'mizbeach. There was a little space between the end of the ramp and the mizbeach, so that you were throwing the meat over an open space. Okay, so that's the machloket Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. It seems that the machloket Rabbi and Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon is very similar, because it seems lema mandam or hortza, the one who says that the sprinkling of the blood can make the kohanim be allowed to allow the kohanim to use the skin, is like the Manda Amar, that you can sprinkle the blood even if the meat is thrown away. Because you don't need the meat. Let's say the meat's tameh, so what? Sprinkle the blood. So you can also sprinkle the blood and keep the skin, right? It's a Manda Amar Hortzak Rabbi Eliezer, Manda Amar Hortzak Rabbi Yeshua, and the opinion that says that the meat, which is Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon's opinion, that the meat is connected to the skin, is the opinion that if you don't have any basar, you can't sprinkle the blood. So those things seem to be connected, right? Says Gemara, not necessarily. Aliba de Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you could sprinkle the blood even without meat, pligi, that clearly the blood can be miratzeh on the skin if it can be miratzeh on the person without any meat. Ki pligi aliba de Rabbi Yeshua. The Machlokas is, what would Rabbi Yeshua say about the skin? Rabbi Yeshua was very clear to us about what he says about the meat. If you don't have meat, don't sprinkle the blood. What if you don't have meat and you sprinkle the blood? What happens to the skin? So Manda Amar Lo Hortza, Rabbi Shimon says it doesn't work. That's like Rabbi Yeshua, that you're not allowed to use the blood to be mitaher, or to purify the skin, just like you can't do it without the meat. Mandam Hortza Amar, he would say to you, this is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he would say, Ad kan look am Rabbi Yeshua hatam el bebasar delekub say to the Kohanim. There, the meat, there's no loss to the Kohanim by saying that you can't sprinkle the blood, right? Because the meat's tameh. So you're saying, should we sprinkle the blood? Says Rabbi Yeshua, don't sprinkle the blood. There's no consequence for the Kohen. There's a big consequence for the owner, because he now has to bring a new karban. But there's no consequence for the Kohanim. Aval or to ikab say to the Kohanim here, by the skin, where the Kohanim would lose out on a lot of money, right? This was probably a significant part of their income, was getting leather and hides and making tefillin, right? So this was a huge part of, or Sifrei Torah, this was a huge part of their income. And so therefore, maybe Rabbi Yeshua says, it's okay, you can sprinkle the blood, because they're going to lose out if you don't sprinkle the blood. So here, the Ikab say to the Kohanim, Rabbi Yeshua moda midi dahavi adi avad. Similar to what happens if you go against the halacha and you do this. Ditznan, because we had in a Mishnah earlier, nitma basar o nifsal. Let's say the meat of a karban, after you shecht it, before you've done srika of the blood, the basar becomes tameh, or nifsal, becomes pasul, because it stays overnight or something, or whatever. O sheyatza chutz l'klayim, or you took it outside the Beit HaMikdash by mistake, and then it becomes pasul with yotzei. Rabbi Eliezer says, doesn't matter. Who cares if you have no meat? Yizrok, sprinkle the blood. And Rabbi Yeshua said, which is what we just had on the machloket, lo yizrok. Umoda Rabbi Yeshua shim zarak hortza. Rabbi Yeshua admits that after the fact, if you did it, it's okay, right? So you're not supposed to do it, but if you did it, you're yotzei the karban. So maybe in this case, when you start talking about the leather, which was the Kohanim's only income, Rabbi Yeshua would say, okay, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world if you do it, and if you do it, it will be okay. And that is the machloket, Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so that's the two dots. Says Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, I don't know what you're talking about. I never saw a situation where they burned the skin of an animal. Always the skin was given to the Kohanim. Sometimes we had to burn the meat, of course. I never saw them burn the skin. Says Gemara, "V'lo." Well, he wasn't paying a lot of attention then, Rabbi Chanina's kind of Kohanim. Because Hare, Parim Nisrafim, Asirim Nisrafim, right? We have specific karbanot where the Torah says, take this karban and burn the whole thing. So where was he then? You burn the whole animal, including the skin, including the meat, including the bones, everything. So what about those? No, of course he didn't mean the animals that you're supposed to burn. Lemitzvatan lo kamrina, not the ones where you're supposed to burn it. He was talking about the ones where you're not supposed to burn it. Says the Gemara, but what about hefshet, kodem hefshet, kodem zrika, right? What about a situation where you didn't skin the animal and the meat becomes tamei? Everybody agreed in the Mishnah that if the meat becomes tamei, you have to burn the meat and you keep the skin with it. We only argued about if you already skinned it. So what's Rechinas Ganakon? I mean, I never saw them burn the skin. You burn the skin all the time if it became tamei. Says Gemara, of course you would, but he means chalutz kamrina, where you already separated the skin from the meat, and then the meat became pasul. I never saw them burn the skin. So I never saw them burn the skin alone, because if they've already skinned the animal, it's always okay to keep it. I asked Gemara, what about after Hefshet, but before Zrika, according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon? Damra ina damra tzel or b'fnei atzmo. Right? Remember, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon's opinion was that even if you skin the animal and you then the basar became tamei, and then you did Zrika, you can't keep the skin. Because since that happened before Zrika, it doesn't work. So what about that case? Says well, obviously he doesn't hold like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi where am I? Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Svirle. He holds like Rebbe, Rebbe was like 250 years later, right? He holds like Rebbe, or the opinion of Rebbe, maybe 200 years later, like the opinion of Rebbe. You could say, I feel it took Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon. Maybe he does agree with the opinion of Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon, but Moda, Rebbe, right? Rebbe himself would admit, she'ein havshet kodem zrika, that there were times that it was very uncommon, as we said earlier in Abaya, that they would do the havshet kodem zrika. So it was very unusual. So if the animal had hefshet kodem zrika, then it's true, and then it became puzzle. You may in fact have to throw it away, but it was very rare for that to happen. And Rabbi Chanina Skanakonim says, I never saw it. Says Gemara, what about a case? What about in a case, this is very interesting, where you find out that the animal is a treifa in the intestines, right, after you do zrika? Meaning, you shechted the animal, the skin was still attached to the meat, right? Generally, then, in order to see the innards of the animal, you would have to flay the animal so you can get in. You'd have to get under the skin, right? So you only find out that it's a treifa once you've already skinned the animal, right? So in this case, the skin is separate from the animal. You then find out it's a treifa. The treifa is old. It happened 2 months ago, right? So it's not like it's a new thing. And therefore, the zrika that you did shouldn't be mechaper on the skin. So you have a situation where you have skin that's already separate from the animal, but according to every opinion in the Mishnah, or at least some opinions, you have to burn that skin. And Rabbi Chinas Ganakonim says, I never saw them burn the skin. Says the Gemara, because it's true. But because even in that case, where am I? Kasava, Rabbi Chinas Ganakonim holds, Nimsei Treifa B'bnei Me'ayim Miratzeh, that in fact you would get a kapara. That if you sprinkled the blood, even though there was a treifa b'bnei me'ayim, since you couldn't know about that treifa before you sprinkled the blood, you get a kapara. Of course, you can't eat the animal. There's no doubt you can't eat it. It's a treifa, but it counts as a valid karban, and the tzitz or the karban is meratzeh, and then you can keep the skin. Okay, dekanami diktani. In fact, this is exactly what Rabbi Akiva said. We said in our Mishnah. We're now 7 lines from the bottom of Kuf Daled Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said in our Mishnah today, midvarav, from the words of Rabbi Chanina Skakonim, lamanu, we learned sham mafshit et ha-bechor, if you skin a bechor, v'nimtza treifa, and you find that inside the internal organs of the bechor there was a treifa, sheyuto l'kohanim ba'oro. Kohanim ba'oro, the kohanim get to keep the skin. Why do the kohanim get to keep the skin? Shema mina, you see from here that that's because, although it was a treifa, the actual action of sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach was mechaper, meaning it was enough to get credit for a karban, and therefore you get to keep the skin. Says the Gemara, okay, so that's the exact same thing Rabbi Akiva said that Rabbi Chinas Kohanim said. So what's the chiddush of Rabbi Akiva? Ella, my kamashwan Rabbi Akiva. What is Rabbi Akiva teaching you? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva is teaching you something fascinating, which is that everything in our Mishnah so far was talking about a karban, right? And a bechor, remember, is usually a karban. Usually, you bring a bechor to the Beit HaMikdash. You bring it to the Kohen, right? The Kohen brings it, right? You give your bechor to a Kohen. The Kohen brings it to the Beit HaMikdash, and in the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohen shechs it, puts the blood on the mizbeach, burns some very small parts of it, and keeps the rest of it. right? But Rabbi Akiva was telling you that this applies even bigvulin, even outside of the Beit HaMikdash. Remember, outside of the Beit HaMikdash, if a Bechor gets a mum and you can't bring it on the Mizbeach, not a treifa, right? A broken leg, that's not a treifa, but it's a mum, then it can't go on the Mizbeach, and the Kohen gets to shecht it in his backyard. There's no zrika, there's no kakrava, but Rabbi Akiva's chiddush is that that's the equivalent of a zrika. And if you then open up the animal and find out that it's a treifa, the fact that you shechted it the right way is as if you brought it on the mizbeach and you're allowed to keep the skin, which is a big chiddush. So that's a chiddush. That Rabbi Akiva's chiddush was where am I? Kamashmalan afilo bigvulin. That even in the gvulin, even outside the Beit Hamikdash, the act of bringing the bechor is almost like bringing a karban. And Amr Bechir Rabban Rabbi Yochanan, the final status in the halacha is halacha Rabbi Akiva, but after Rabbi Akiva lo Amar el kashetira mumcha. Rabbi Akiva only said a bechor that was shechted because a mumcha said it's allowed to shecht it. But if you did it yourself, avalo tira mumcha lo. If a mumcha didn't say you're allowed to shecht it, and you said, "Oh, I think it's a bechor," then obviously shechting it was not permitted. You were breaking the rule, and then shechting it does not permit you to use the skin, and that is the halacha according to the Gemara. But says the Gemara, don't get too comfortable because in fact that's wrong. In fact, the halacha is not like Rabbi Akiva and Rechinas Kanakonim in this version. It's like the Chachamim. Rashi takes out the next lines because they don't make a lot of sense. But that's the halacha, that you don't actually get to keep the skin if you can't keep the meat. Continues the Mishnah now. That was a complicated Gemara. I hope it was clear enough, but could stop me for any questions. Continues the Mishnah now at the bottom of Kuf Daled Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the bottom. What about the final case that we're really final for us now is the case of Parima Nisrafim Usirima Nisrafim, right? So remember the Torah talks about animals that you're supposed to burn them completely. And we say, I'm going to read the pasuk because it's going to be very relevant, and Nava has it. Hasaref, this is in Bamidbar Tet Zayin Chaf Hey, Chafchet maybe? Chafchet. Hasarefotam, the person who burns these parim and sirim and israfim, like the carbonate that you have to bring inside, right? They are yichabes begadav. They have to wash their clothing, meaning they become tamei. So you're supposed to burn them. We're going to see you burn them outside of the Beit Hamikdash, outside of all 3 machanot, outside of Jerusalem, and the person who burns them becomes tamei. Okay. And has to go to the mikveh and is tahar that night and wash their clothing. Says the Mishnah, Parim nisrafim, Masirim nisrafim, Bisman shehein nisrafim kimitzvatan. If you burn them properly, meaning you did the karban properly, nothing was wrong, and now you're going to burn them the way the Torah says to burn them, then nisrafim be Beit HaDeshen. You burn them in the Beit HaDeshen. We'll see in the Gemara the Beit HaDeshen was outside of Yerushalayim, so outside of all 3 machanot. There was a burning pit, we'll call it, and that's where you would burn them. If they are, mitamim begadim, and the person who burns them is tamei, and their begadim become tamei as well. Im einan nisrafim kemitzvatam, if they're not burned according to the way the Torah wants you to, meaning, let's say the animal becomes tamei, so now you're burning it because it's a puzzle animal, not because you did it properly, then you just burn it like every other animal, nisrafim bebayit, bebeit habira, sorry, you burn it in the Beit HaMikdash, in the place called the Bira, we'll see where that is in a second. But ena mitami begadim, then you're not doing the proper sreifa, and therefore the halacha being tamei does not apply to you. So you don't become tamei. Okay, turn the page. Daf Kuf Daled Amud Bet. Hayisovlin oto b'motot. Let's say you're carrying this power on a spade, on a spit, we'll call it, right? Because they're very heavy. A power would weigh several thousand pounds, right? So it's very hard for one person to carry. So they would hang them on these pieces of wood, spits. And they would walk out of the Beit HaMikdash carrying it on their shoulders, right? So in that process, Yatzu HaRishonim chutz l'chomat HaZara, the first people, the front people, walk outside of the walls of the Azara, and the Achronim lo Yatzu. But the outside people didn't walk out yet. And then, whatever, something happens and they drop it, okay? Says the Mishnah, HaRishonim mitamim begadim, Achronim einam mitamim begadim. The first ones are tamei because they're carrying it out. So once you've actually carried it outside the Azara, you started the process of carrying it out. But the outside ones are carrying it, but they didn't leave the Azara yet. So they're not tamei yet, right? Until they actually walk outside. Yatsu, once they do walk outside, we'll see in the Gemara why we're telling all this, but they're both tamei. Rabbi Shimon says, no. It's not carrying it outside that makes it tamei. It's burning it that makes you tamei. So you're not tamei until the flame is actually catching on the meat. And most of it's on fire. So it's not the carrying it that's metame and preparing it, it's the actual burning it. Again, we'll discuss this in the Gemara tomorrow or in the next day. Nitach basar. Now, once the meat becomes, I don't know how you translate nitach, but it means like hardened. So it's like charcoal, basically. So it's totally burned. Then, Eina Sarif Matame Begadim, the person who keeps burning it after that is no longer Matame Begadim because it's not considered to be meat anymore. Miriam, do you have an English word for me? Or
Decomposed?
Nitach habasar. What does it say? Decomposed?
Oh, yeah,
Scorched.
decomposed.
Okay.
Once the beast has decomposed.
Scorched is the word that Corin uses.
Scorched, yeah. Okay, so either way, but it means burned, basically. So once the meat is completely burned, then if you further burn it, you're not doing the streifa, and you're not tameh, because it's already burned. Okay. Says the Gemara today, my bira, when he said in the Mishnah, you take it out to the bira, right? What's the bira? I mean, we don't say take it out. We say you take it out to the Beit HaDeshen. If it becomes tameh in the azara, you burn it in the bira on the Harabayit. What's the bira? Amar Rabbi Baruch Hanam Rabbi Yochanan, Makom Yesh Harabayit. There was a place on Har HaBayit, Ubira Shmo, and it was called Bira. Bira means the burning pit. Rish Lakish says, no. The whole bayit, Kol HaBayit Kula Korei Bira. Shenemar, because the pasuk in Divrei Yamim says that David HaMelech said, El HaBira Asher HaChinota. Maybe it doesn't say El. It says, V'livnot HaBira Asher HaChinota. David tells Shlomo, I want you to build the Bira that I prepared. So the Bira refers to the whole Beit HaMikdash. So it means in the Beit HaMikdash. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Baravua, we are around 10 lines from the top of Kufdal and Amabet. Shlosha Beit HaDeshanim Hein. There's 3 burning pits for Karbanot. Beit HaDeshen Gadol Haya Ba'azara. There was one big pit in the temple, in the courtyard, and you would burn everything we've talked about in Zechet Zevachim in that place. Every animal that became pasul, every animal that stayed overnight, everything that was pigel, every notar, all these things you would burn in the Beit HaMikdash, in that big pit, right? So that was Ba'azara, Shisham Sarfim, Psulei Kache Kachim, the psulim of any carbon that's Kache Kachim, because remember, Kache Kachim don't leave the Azara, right? You're supposed to eat them and burn them in the Azara. If you mess them up, they become Tameh, they become Notar, whatever, you burn them on that pit in the Azara. Imurei Kachim Kalim, and the limbs of Kachim Kalim that became Pasul, they're supposed to go on the Mizbeach. If they can't go on the Mizbeach, they go in this pit. Uparim anisrafim, masir anisrafim, and the parim anisrafim, masir anisrafim of our Mishnah, she'ira behem psul kodem zrika. If they became pasul before you do zrikat dam, so you shech the animal and then it becomes tameh, right? And where am I? That's right. Ubeta, that's one. That's the first one. The second one was Beit HaDeshen Achar HaBayit. There was a second Beit HaDeshen outside of the Azara on Har HaBayit. Shesham sarfim parim anisrafim masirim anisrafim. You would burn the parim there if they had a psul achar zrika. She'ira b'hem psul achar zrika. So you would shech the animal, you would sprinkle the blood, and then they became tameh. So you don't carry it outside the 3 machanot and burn it where it's supposed to. You burn it right outside the azara. Ukem mitzvatan. And if you did it properly, meaning it didn't become tameh, you did the parim anisrafim properly, then you take it chutz l'shalosh machanot. Then you take it outside all 3 camps. So remember, parim anisrafim are certain parim and sirim that you're supposed to burn them completely. If you do everything properly, you take them outside of 3 camps and burn them all the way outside all 3 machanot outside of Yerushalayim. If you did something improper, so then it depends. If it became pasul before Zrika, you burn it in the Azara, meaning it never leaves the Azara. If it became pasul after Zrika, then once you did Zrika, you're supposed to carry it outside and burn it all the way outside Yerushalayim. If it became pasul, you burn it on the Har Bayit. Okay, that's the 3 categories. That was the first opinion. That's Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua. Tani Levi. Now Levi taught a different brayta, and Levi's brayta said the following: Shlosha Beit HaDeshanim Heim. There's 3 burning pits and same categories. Beit HaDeshen Gadol, Beit HaDeshen Gadol Haya Bazara. There was one big burning pit in the temple courtyard itself. Shisham Sarfim Psulei Kachi Kachem Ve'Murei Kachim Kalim. The same things we said earlier, but also Parim Anisrafim Usirim Anisrafim. Now, earlier we said those that became pasul before Zrika. Levi's version is no. She'ir ben psul, ben kodem Zrika, ben la'achar Zrika. Whether the psul happened before Zrika or after Zrika, if the animal or the meat is still in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Azara, you burn it right there. Don't take it out. But if you have a second Beit HaDeshen Acher Haya Behar HaBayit, and what did they do? The other Beit HaDeshen that was outside of the Azara on Har HaBayit, Shesham sarfim parim anisrafim, mashiram anisrafim, she'ira behem psul b'yitziatan. If they had a psul after you took them out or while you were taking them out, so then you left the azara and then they became tamei, let's say, or something. So then you burn them on the harabayit. But if they never became tamei and they're kosher, kemitzvatam, they're their proper thing, then you go chutz l'sholosh machanot. Okay, so that's the machloket about whether you burn sparim anisrafim that became tamei or pasul after the zrika in the azara or in the harabayit. That's the only argument. Ask the Gemara halfway down of Yod Kufdal on the bet. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked a very interesting question. We've had a halacha many times in Zevachim that if you take a carbon, it's supposed to be burned on the mizbeach, or blood, it's supposed to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. If you leave it overnight, it becomes pasul, right? What about parim hanisrafim? So parim hanisrafim are supposed to be taken. You take the animal, you carry it outside the azar, you carry it outside the Beit HaMikdash, you carry it outside Yerushalayim, and you burn it outside there. Let's say you did a par in the afternoon, you forgot all about it. You come the next morning and it's sitting in a corner, this pile of meat, which obviously wouldn't happen, but let's say it happened. And the question is, does that become pasul with lina, and now you burn it inside the azara? Or do we say, look, lina is only relevant when you're supposed to be doing something in the Beit HaMikdash? Since you're not doing anything in the Beit HaMikdash for this, you're carrying it outside and burning it in, outside of Yerushalayim, lina shouldn't be relevant. So that was the question.
Is the paraduma an example of this, or is that outside there?
Paraduma is not an example. This is a good question, but the paraduma is never shechted in the Beit HaMikdash, right? So the paraduma was not done. The paraduma itself is not a carbon. It's not burned on the mizbeach.
So where's that?
But the place it's burnt, is that one of these three places, or it's burnt in another place?
It's burnt in another place. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's
another place.
Another place. Yes. So as Rabbi Yirmiyah, lina mao shetoil beparim hanisrafim v'sirim hanisrafim. Does lina help? Meaning, does it make them pasul? And as we just said before, if it's pasul, you don't burn it outside of Yerushalayim, you burn it in the azara. So does lina make it pasul? Mi amrina, do you say ki mahanya lina bebasar debar achila? Lina helps when there's talking about meat that you're supposed to eat. Now, to be clear, not only a person eating it, but the mizbeach eating it, right? So meat that either a human eats or a mizbeach eats, right? If you leave it overnight, it becomes pasul, and now you have to burn it. Avalhani, beparim hanisrafim, delav b'nei achilin, they're never eaten. They're burnt completely outside. Lo, lina does not have an impact. It doesn't even make them pasul. Odilma loshna, or do you say there's no difference? Lina is lina is lina, and it makes it pasul. So Amar Rava, now Rava said, that's a great question, Rabbi Yirmiyah. You know something? Hamilta ibaya leila Abaya. Abaya asked the same question. Great minds think alike. I heard Abaya wonder the same question, and Abaya came up with an answer. He was a little smarter than you. Pashat nalei meha. He learned it from the following Breita. The Breita says, and this is a Breita we had way back, earlier in the Masechta, like 60, 70 dapim ago, where we had a whole discussion about pigul. And there was a machloket about pigul. Remember, pigul is where you're supposed to sprinkle the blood of an animal, you're supposed to eat an animal, or burn it, and you have a machshava to do that chutz l'zmano, in the wrong time. So you're thinking, I'm shechting this animal, I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow. I can't do it today. Or I'm going to eat it tomorrow. Or I'm going to burn it on the mizbeach tomorrow. So we said in that way back when, that what about carbonot that are done lifnai v'lifnim, well, lifnim, not lifnai v'lifnim, like the parham davar shel tzibur, right? What about those carbonot? You're supposed to burn them on the mizbeach inside, right? And sprinkle them on the mizbeach inside. So does pigul affect those carbonot or not? And we had a machloket tanaim before. There was a machloket whether it does or not. But continues the Breita now in that context, vishavim, but everybody agrees, where am I? Shavim, around, 20 lines from the bottom. She'im chishev ba'achilat parim. If you think about eating the par helam davar shel tzibur, which is one of the parim hanisrafim, or b'sreifatam, or you're shechting this animal, you think, I'm going to eat it tomorrow. Now, you're never supposed to eat it. Or you think, I'm going to burn it in 5 days. You're supposed to burn it today, right? Shelo asa klum. It's not pigul, because pigul only applies to carbonot that are done inside the Beit HaMikdash. Since this burning was not done in the Beit HaMikdash, there's no pigul. Now, my love, you should conclude from there that maybe, just like there's no pigul, there's no notar, right? Maybe. Mida machshava lo pasla, sorry, not no notar, lo lina. Lina nami lo pasla. That's not necessarily. I mean, how do you know it's the same thing? One is a thought, and one is actual, the meat stayed overnight. Dilma machshavahu de lo pasla. A thought about it doesn't pasla. Avalina pasla. So I can't really prove it from there. Okay, tashma. Let's prove it from the following Breita.
That was a bias proof.
The Breita says that was a bias proof, but the Gemara said it's not great. Maybe that's why Rabbi Yirmiyah didn't like it. But tashma, let's prove it from the next Breita. The Breita says the following: Parim hanisrafim v'sirim hanisrafim. Right? A person takes a par sayer that's burned. He goes to the Beit HaMikdash. He says, "This par, I'm dedicating this par for the parim hanisrafim." So the moment you dedicate that animal, it belongs to Hekdesh. If you then use that animal to plow your field, or you ride it, or you take a piece off it, then that's called mi'ila, right? So says the Braita, parim hanisrafim, sirim hanisrafim, mo'alim bahen, you're chayav mi'ila if you use them, misha hukdeshu, once you give them to Hekdesh. Nishchatu, once they're shechted, the mi'ila doesn't go away, right? But huchsharuli pasel b'tful yom mechusar kippurim, now they become pasal if a tful yom touches them or mechusar kippurim touches them, ubelina, and they become pasal with lina. So the Braita very clearly says that lina applies to parim hanisrafim. Now, we don't know if that means the part you're supposed to burn on the mizbeach, which are the limbs, or it means, but you put some on the mizbeach and you put the rest burnt outside. So it doesn't mean my love, linat basar. Maybe it means leaving over the meat, which is what you burn outside. No, linat emurim. It means leaving over the parts that go on the mizbeach, which of course, since it applies to the mizbeach, applies to the lina. Says the Gemara, but in the end of the Braita, it clearly doesn't mean that. Hamid Tani Seifa, if you look at the end of the Braita, it says, Kulan, all these karbanot, ma'alin bahem bebeit hadeshen, you keep being chayiv mi'ila on a karban if it's out in the burning lands, burning pit, ad sheyutach habasar, until the basar becomes scorched, right? So clearly there we're talking about the meat, right? Meaning, let's say you take meat from the parim hanisrafim and use it to feed your animal. You're chayiv mi'ila until it's scorched and it's no longer food anymore. Right? So the seifa basar, since the seifa is clearly talking about the meat that you're supposed to burn outside, reisha nami basar, it's not a proof. Media area, who can prove that? Seifa basar, reisha imurim. Maybe they're talking about different things. Okay, Tashma, let's bring one more proof. We are at the sixth to last narrow line. The Tani Levi. We just quoted Levi like a few minutes ago, who said that there was a special place where you would burn the karbanot of the parim hanisrafim that became puzzle after you took them out. Right? She'ira, let me read that. She'ira b'amsol b'yitziatan. Now, what can happen b'yitziatan? Right? You took it out, so it didn't become possible in the Mishkan. What happened to it? My love, lina. It must be that you took it out and you left it overnight. It's like, not necessarily. Why can't you say it's tuma? Lo psul tuma, upsul yitzia. Maybe it means a question of tuma and a question of yitzia. Now, tuma is obvious to us, right? You took the animal out, it just became tameh. What is yitzia? So this gets us back to the last few minutes of tonight, to a Gemara that we had a couple weeks ago, which this is the one we had together 3 weeks ago, I think, where there was a discussion about what happens if you take out a karban. Remember, a karban that was brought out of the azara becomes pasul. So if you shecht your animal, let's say kache kadashim, they're supposed to be burned and eaten in the azara. If you carry it outside, you have to throw it away, you have to burn it, okay, and not eat it. What about a karban that's supposed to be brought outside of the azara? For example, shlamim. Right? So we had an argument, remember we had a machloket earlier. If you shech the shlamim and you then do zrika on that shlamim, you're supposed to carry that shlamim home with you and eat it for lunch. But what if you took it home before you did the zrika? Right? So you left the azara before you're supposed to leave the azara. Is that a psul yotze or not a psul yotze? So the same thing might be true about parim hanisrafim. Parim hanisrafim, the meat of the parim hanisrafim is supposed to be burned outside of Yerushalayim. But it's only supposed to be burned outside of Yerushalayim after you do zrika. What if you carry it out before you do zrika? So maybe that also becomes puzzle, and therefore you burn that animal not outside Yerushalayim like you're supposed to, but on the Beit HaDeshen, on the Harabayit. Okay? Now, says the Gemara, that's a good answer, but let me ask that question very explicitly. Now, the fourth to last narrow line. By Rebbe Elazar, probably. Yitzia ma'ashtol barim nisrafim. Is that true, what I just told you? Does taking the animal outside of the Beit HaMikdash, before the Zrika, because remember, after the Zrika, you're supposed to take it outside. But if you take it out before the Zrika, does that make it puzzle and it's no longer suitable for a par hanisraf and has to be repeated? So does Yitzia mashto b'rem nisrafim esir nisrafim? Says my coming. What's the question? Amar Abba. What we're asking is the following: Aliba demanda Amar. According to the person who says if you take a shlamim outside of the Beit HaMikdash before Zrika, that puzzles the shlamim because that dayan lo hagias mano latzeit. It's not yet the time to bring it out. Meaning, of course, you're supposed to bring your shlamim home after Zrika, but you're not supposed to bring it home now. So, Amrina, do you say, well, how do you mean the basar? That's referring to the meat of the shlamim. The ein sofo latzeit chova. You don't have to take it outside of the Beit HaMikdash. You could eat a shlamim in the azar if you want to. You're allowed to take it out, but you don't have to take it out. So there, if you took it out early, it's considered yitzia. Aval hani b'bayis parim hanisrafim, you have to take them out. That's the mitzvah. Right? So from latzeit chova, it's a requirement to take them out eventually. So maybe taking them out early doesn't puzzle them. Lo. Or Dilmar, perhaps, hachanami lo giz, mano letzeit. Here too, it's not the right time. You're not supposed to take out the meat until the Zrika, and you didn't do Zrika yet. So Tashma, let's try to prove an answer from Levi. Again, exactly what we quoted earlier, where Levi said that there's a special place in Harabayit where you burn the parim and esrafim that became pasul after you took them out, right? She'ira bahem pasul biyitziato. What does that mean, biyitziato? My love, pasul yitziyah. It must be you took it out before the Zrika. So this proves that, in fact, it becomes pasul. And answers the Gemara like we just did a few minutes ago. No, it could be a psul tuma. It could be it became pasul tuma, or even psul lina if you hold lina apostles, which we didn't resolve. So we didn't resolve yitzia, we didn't resolve lina, but tuma for sure is always the way to get out of it, right? An animal that went outside of the azara, was taken outside, and then became tameh, is burned on a special spot. And so we don't resolve this question, and we leave it as an open question. And we're going to stop here because it was a long daf, and we started early. And also, we'll have plenty to learn tomorrow. Very exciting stuff about parim hanisrafim. It's a lot of.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Shavua Tov. We're learning tomorrow morning at 7:45. Hope all can join.
No idea where he is. It was just way too fast.
Have a good night.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Somewhere on side B.
We're at 4 lines from the bottom, as we said. 4 lines from the bottom of the daf of Kuf Dalet Amud Bet, I believe. We'll pick it up tomorrow.